The cold Manhattan air did little to cool the hot flush of humiliation rising on Kate's neck. There she stood draped in a gown that had cost her a month's profit at the velvet rope of the city's most exclusive charity gala. And there he was, her ex-husband Richard Sterling, smirking from the other side. "I'm sorry," the guard said, his voice flat. "Vance is not on the list." Richard's grin widened. He had orchestrated this, a public execution of her social standing. But just as the first tear threatened to fall, a voice smooth as aged whiskey and twice as potent cut through the night. "She is with me." The invitation had arrived a month ago, nestled amongst the bills and junk mail that constituted Kate Vance's new reality. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind that felt heavy with the promise of importance. The emblem of the Starlight Foundation was embossed in gold leaf at the top. For a moment she thought it was a mistake, a cruel joke forwarded from her old life. The life where she was, Mrs. Kate Sterling, wife of the tech boom titan, Richard Sterling, a man who collected companies like he collected art, with a cold, appraising eye and a focus solely on their value. Their divorce had been finalized 6 months prior, a brutal affair that stripped her of more than just her married name. Richard's lawyers, a pack of legal sharks from the prestigious firm of Cromwell and Swain, had painted her as a decorative gold digger. They'd argued that her contribution to his empire was non-existent, conveniently ignoring the countless dinners she'd hosted, the investors she'd charmed, and the social bridges she'd built that his abrasive personality would have otherwise burned. In the end, she'd walked away with a settlement that was insulting by their standards, but just enough for her to start over far from his shadow. She had poured every ounce of that settlement and her soul into her true passion, jewelry design. Atelier Vance was her fledgling dream. A tiny studio in the meatpacking district where she crafted bespoke pieces, her hands finally creating something tangible, something that was hers alone. The Starlight Gala wasn't just a party. It was a nexus of the exact clientele she needed to reach. The guest list was a roll call of New York's elite old-money philanthropists, tech billionaires, art collectors, and fashion moguls. Getting her work in front of even one of them could change everything. She suspected Richard was a primary sponsor of the event. It was his favorite kind of philanthropy, the type that came with a press release and a photo opportunity. The thought of seeing him made her stomach clench. He had a new girlfriend, a model named Tiffany, who was a decade younger and possessed the kind of vacant beauty Richard now preferred. He had made it clear that in his world Kate Vance no longer existed. "You have to go." Her friend Clara had insisted over coffee. "You can't let him scare you out of your own future. Wear the most breathtaking thing you own, hold your head high, and network until your cheeks hurt from smiling." Clara was right. Hiding was not an option. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. So Kate had set to work. She spent weeks designing and crafting a single magnificent piece for herself, a necklace she called the Phoenix. It was a delicate, intricate creation of white gold and platinum, with a spray of tiny, ethically sourced diamonds that culminated in a single flawless fire opal at its center. The stone seemed to flicker with an internal light, a perfect metaphor for her own rebirth from the ashes of her marriage. The dress came next. She couldn't afford the haute couture she once wore, but she found a stunning floor-length gown of liquid silver silk from a rising designer. It was elegant, modern, and powerful. When she put it on for the first time in a long time, she didn't see the ghost of Mrs. Sterling in the mirror. She saw Kate Vance, founder and chief designer of Atelier Vance. On the night of the gala, a nervous energy buzzed under her skin. She did her own makeup, her hands surprisingly steady as she swept a dramatic black liner across her eyelids. She styled her own hair, letting it fall in soft waves over her shoulders. The Phoenix necklace felt cool against her skin, a talisman of her newfound strength. As the Uber wound its way through the glittering canyons of Midtown Manhattan, towards the Plaza Hotel where the gala was being held, a familiar dread began to creep in. What if Richard made a scene? What if people whispered behind their hands, pitying the cast-off wife? She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on her goal. She had a small, velvet-lined case in her clutch containing 3 of her finest pieces, a pair of sapphire earrings, a diamond-encrusted bracelet, and a stunning emerald cocktail ring. She just needed a chance. Just one conversation. 1 foot in the door. She had no idea the door was about to be slammed in her face. The scene outside the plaza was a controlled chaos of flashing cameras shouting paparazzi and a river of Blacktown cars. Kate paid her driver and stepped out the cool October air, a stark contrast to the nervous heat building inside her. She took a deep breath, the scent of expensive perfume and city grit filling her lungs, and joined the queue of elegantly dressed guests inching towards the entrance. The line moved slowly, a parade of Chanel bags and Rolex watches. As she drew closer, she could see the entrance was managed by a team of imposing security guards in black suits, their faces stoic as they checked names against a list on a tablet. And then she saw him. Richard. He wasn't in the queue, of course. He was standing just inside the entrance holding court with a small group of men, a glass of champagne in his hand. He looked exactly the same, impeccably dressed in a custom Brioni tuxedo, his salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed. His new girlfriend Tiffany clung to his arm, looking bored and beautiful in a shockingly red dress. He hadn't seen her yet. Kate's heart hammered against her ribs. Maybe she could slip past. Maybe he wouldn't notice. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the ornate gilded doors of the hotel. She was only 2 people away from the check-in point now. The couple in front of her, a well-known real estate mogul and his wife, were waved through with a deferential nod. It was her turn. She stepped forward, a polite smile fixed on her face. "Kate Vance," she said, her voice clearer than she expected. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a scar above his eyebrow, tapped her name into the tablet. He frowned, tapping again. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Could you spell that for me?" "Vance," she spelled out slowly, the blood starting to pound in her ears. His eyes scanned the screen. "I'm not seeing it. Are you sure the invitation was under this name?" "Yes, of course," she said, her smile starting to feel brittle. "Perhaps check under Sterling. Sometimes there are mix-ups." It tasted like ash to say her old name, but she was desperate. The guard tried the name, his expression unchanging. "No, nothing under Sterling either." It was then that Richard made his move. He'd been watching, she realized, a predator enjoying the struggle of his prey. He detached himself from his group and sauntered over the picture of condescending concern. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice booming slightly, ensuring everyone within earshot could hear. The security guard looked relieved to see a familiar, powerful face. "Mr. Sterling, this lady is trying to get in, but her name isn't on our list." Richard looked at Kate, feigning surprise. "Kate, what are you doing here?" He said her name as if it were a foreign word he was struggling to pronounce. The implication was clear. "You don't belong." "I was invited, Richard," she said, her voice tight, refusing to let him see her crumble. She held his gaze, a silent battle being waged in front of the gatekeepers of New York society. He gave a short, pitying laugh. "Oh, there must have been some mistake. A clerical error. You know how these things are." He turned to the guard, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial man-to-man tone. "My ex-wife. The divorce was difficult. She's a little confused, I think. Believes she still belongs to this world." The humiliation was a physical blow. It was sharp hot, and it stole her breath. The people behind her in the queue were starting to whisper, their curious glances turning into stares of pity and judgment. The guard's professional demeanor shifted to one of wary sympathy, the kind you give to someone who is clearly unwell. "I have the invitation right here," Kate said, her hand trembling as she reached for her clutch, but she knew it was useless. Richard was a benefactor, a man who wrote 7-figure checks to this foundation. His word was gospel. "That won't be necessary," Richard said smoothly, placing a hand on the guard's shoulder. "We don't want to make a scene. Just see that she gets a taxi and finds her way home safely. I'll cover any inconvenience." He gave Kate one last dismissive look, a look that said, "I win. I always win," before turning his back on her and melting back into the party. The guard turned to her, his face now a mask of professional regret. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up the line." The world seemed to shrink, the flashing cameras and muffled laughter blurring into a nightmarish din. She was on an island of shame, completely alone. She had been so foolish to think she could compete, so naive to believe she could re-enter this world on her own terms. Richard had not only slammed the door, he had locked it, bolted it, and stood laughing on the other side. Defeated, she nodded mutely and took a step back, ready to retreat into the shadows of the city. As Kate turned to leave, the sting of tears blurring the glittering city lights, a vehicle pulled up to the curb, gliding to a silent stop. It wasn't one of the ubiquitous black Escalades or S-Class Mercedes. This was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, its bespoke midnight blue paint seeming to drink the light around it. It exuded a quiet, absolute authority that made even the most jaded paparazzi pause. The chauffeur, dressed in a crisp gray uniform, hurried to open the rear passenger door. A single exquisitely crafted leather shoe emerged, followed by a man who unfolded himself from the car with an easy, unhurried grace. He was tall and lean, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that was understated yet screamed Savile Row. His hair was dark with a hint of silver at the temples that only served to accentuate his sharp, intelligent features. There was an air of stillness about him, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the red carpet. This was Julian Devereux. Even Kate, who had been out of the social loop, knew the name. The Devereux family was old money with a fortune built over generations in shipping, finance, and art. But Julian had taken that legacy and amplified it, moving into disruptive tech investments and green energy with a Midas touch. Unlike Richard's loud look-at-me brand of wealth, Julian Devereux was famously private, almost reclusive. He rarely attended such events, and when he did, it was on his own terms. His presence alone was enough to create a stir. He handed his keys to the valet and adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, paused for a moment on Richard holding court inside, then moved to the tableau at the velvet rope. The flustered security guard, the whispering onlookers, and the lone woman in the silver dress, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Kate was completely unaware of his scrutiny. Her only focus was on escaping, on getting away before she completely fell apart. She took a step towards the street to hail a cab, her beautiful evening ruined. "Is there a problem here?" The voice cut through her haze of misery. It was calm, measured, and carried an unmistakable note of command. Kate stopped, turning her head slightly. Julian Devereux was walking directly towards the security checkpoint. The head guard immediately stiffened, his professional demeanor snapping back into place, now tinged with deference. "Mr. Devereux." "Good evening, sir." "No problem at all." Julian's gaze flickered to Kate and then back to the guard. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "It appears there is. This lady seems to be having some difficulty gaining entry." Before the guard could stammer out an explanation, Richard, having noticed the arrival of a true titan, hurried back to the entrance, his plastic smile firmly in place. "Julian, good to see you. We were just clearing up a minor misunderstanding. A gatecrasher, you know how it is." He waved a dismissive hand in Kate's direction, not even bothering to look at her. Julian's cool gray eyes settled on Richard, and for the first time a flicker of something cold and sharp appeared in them. "A gatecrasher. That's interesting. I was under the impression I was meeting my guest here." A stunned silence fell over the small crowd. Richard's smile faltered a crack in his polished facade. Your guest," he stammered. Julian Devereux took 2 steps forward, closing the distance until he was standing beside Kate. He didn't know her personally, but he had read a feature on emerging artisans in a financial journal, and a photo of Kate Vance standing proudly in her studio had stuck with him. He'd admired the fierce determination in her eyes and the unique architectural quality of her designs. He recognized her instantly, and he recognized the look of a man like Richard Sterling, a bully who derived pleasure from kicking someone who was already down. It was a type of man he despised. He turned his full attention to Kate, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "My apologies for being late, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice now a warm, intimate murmur meant only for her. The traffic was dreadful. Kate stared at him, utterly bewildered. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Julian Devereux knew her name. He was calling her his guest. He then extended his arm, a silent, elegant invitation. It was a lifeline, a choice. She could either question the miracle or accept it. Looking from Julian's steady, reassuring gaze to Richard's face, which was now a mask of pure choleric rage, the choice was simple. With a newfound surge of adrenaline, she lifted her chin, the fire opal of her phoenix necklace catching the light. She gracefully placed her hand on Julian Devereux's offered arm. "You're here now," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "That's all that matters." Julian gave a slight nod to the dumbfounded security guard. "We'll be going in now." It wasn't a request. The velvet rope was unclipped so fast it was almost comical. Without another glance at the sputtering, incandescently furious Richard Sterling, Julian Devereux escorted Kate Vance into the Starlight Gala, leaving a tableau of open mouths and shattered egos in their wake. The whispers had already begun. Crossing the threshold of the plaza's grand ballroom on the arm of Julian Devereux was like stepping into another dimension. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and champagne, and the sound was a symphony of clinking crystal orchestral music and the low, powerful hum of 100 different conversations. Light from gargantuan crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, fractured and danced across the room, catching on diamonds and sequins, turning the entire space into a glittering galaxy of wealth and influence. If Kate had walked in alone, she would have been a ghost, an invisible entity clinging to the edges of the room, desperately trying to catch someone's eye. But on Julian's arm, she was the center of the universe. Every head turned. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Eyes widened over the rims of champagne flutes. The social elite of New York were witnessing something impossible. The notoriously private Julian Devereux arriving not just fashionably late, but with Richard Sterling's disgraced ex-wife on his arm. The unspoken question hung in the air, electric and tantalizing. Why Kate could feel the weight of their stares, but for the first time it wasn't a burden. Shielded by Julian's formidable presence, the looks were not of pity, but of intrigue, curiosity, and even envy. Her earlier humiliation felt like a distant memory, a bad dream from which she had just been woken. She straightened her spine, the liquid silver of her dress shimmering with her every move. "Are you all right?" Julian's voice was low, a private anchor in the swirling sea of society. "I am now," she replied, her voice filled with a gratitude so immense she could barely put it into words. "I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to do that." "A man like Richard Sterling thrives on public displays of power," Julian said, his eyes scanning the room with a calm, analytical gaze. "There is nothing more satisfying than watching such a man's power evaporate when confronted with something real." He glanced down at her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Besides, I believe bullies should be put in their place." Just then, a formidable woman with a severe silver bob and a dress that looked like a piece of modern architecture descended upon them. It was Beatrice Lipton, the chairwoman of the Starlight Foundation and the undisputed queen of New York philanthropy. "Julian, we'd almost given up on you," she said, her sharp eyes flicking from him to Kate and back again. "Beatrice, you know I like to make an entrance," he replied smoothly. "Allow me to introduce my guest, Kate Vance. She's the brilliant designer behind Atelier Vance." He hadn't just called her his guest, he had endorsed her professionally. In that single sentence he had given her more legitimacy than she could have hoped to achieve in a year. Beatrice's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Atelier Vance. How intriguing. I'm not familiar. Before Kate could even formulate a reply, Julian continued, "You will be. Her work is a remarkable fusion of classic technique and modern sensibility." She has a piece in the upcoming Sotheby's Jewels of Tomorrow auction. It's expected to cause quite a stir." This was news to Kate. She hadn't submitted anything to Sotheby's. She looked at him in confusion, but he gave her hand a barely perceptible squeeze, a silent instruction to play along. She understood immediately. He wasn't just helping her. He was building her a legend right here on the ballroom floor. Beatrice Lipton, whose business was knowing everything about everyone, was now looking at Kate with a newfound respect. To be championed by Julian Devereux was one thing. To be featured at Sotheby's was another entirely. "Well, Miss Vance," she said, her tone completely transformed, "we must talk later. I'm always on the lookout for new artists to support." As Beatrice swept away, no doubt to begin her intelligence gathering, Kate turned to Julian. "Sotheby's," she whispered, half amused, half terrified. "A friend of mine is a curator there," he murmured, taking 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and handing one to her. "I'll make a call tomorrow. I trust you have a piece worthy of the hype." She thought of the emerald ring in her clutch. "I might have something." "I have no doubt." From across the room she could see Richard. He was standing with his back ramrod straight, Tiffany clinging to him like a designer accessory. His face was a thundercloud. He was watching them, his eyes burning with a venomous fury. He had tried to cast her out, to label her a nobody. But in a single masterful stroke, Julian Devereux had not only brought her back in, he had placed her on a pedestal higher than she had ever been, even as Mrs. Sterling. The silent war had been declared, and Richard Sterling, for the first time in his life, was losing. The next hour was a blur of introductions and air kisses. Julian, it turned out, was a master of social navigation. He guided Kate through the glittering throngs with the quiet confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. He didn't just introduce her, he curated her encounters. First, it was Marcus Thorne, the fiercely critical editor of Vogue, a man whose opinion could make or break a brand overnight. Julian presented her not as a date, but as an artist. "Marcus, I want you to meet Kate Vance," he said, as Marcus eyed her phoenix necklace with a professional, calculating gaze. "She designed and crafted this piece herself. It's called the Phoenix. Rather fitting, don't you think?" Marcus Thorne leaned in, peering at the necklace through his signature black-framed glasses. He was silent for a long moment. "The setting on that opal. It's audacious. Very clever. It's alive." He looked directly at Kate. "Call my office on Monday. We're doing a feature on neo-artisans. I may have a spot." Kate's heart leaped. A feature in Vogue. It was an impossible dream. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. I will." Next was a brief but potent conversation with Antoine Dubois, the lead acquisitions curator for the Museum of Modern Art's design collection. Julian mentioned her unique architectural forms, and Dubois, a man whose praise was notoriously sparse, gave a thoughtful nod and handed her his card, telling her to send her portfolio. With every introduction, Kate felt herself growing taller, more confident. She spoke about her work with a passion that had been dormant for too long. She explained her process, her inspiration drawn from nature and architecture, and the stories she sought to tell with metal and stone. People listened. They were not just being polite to Julian Devereux's companion, they were genuinely interested in Kate Vance, the designer. The whispers followed them everywhere. "That's Sterling's ex-wife. Can you believe it? He threw her out and Devereux picked her up at the door. They say her jewelry line is the next big thing. Marcus Thorne was practically drooling over her necklace. Richard looks like he's about to have an aneurysm. I've never seen him so publicly humiliated." The schadenfreude was palpable. Richard had built his reputation on being an untouchable kingmaker. Tonight the whispers painted him as a fool, a man who had discarded a diamond and was now forced to watch as a more discerning connoisseur displayed it as the treasure it was. Kate caught sight of him again. He was trying to engage a prominent senator in conversation, but the senator's eyes kept flicking over Richard's shoulder towards Kate and Julian. Tiffany was looking increasingly agitated, her perfectly painted smile stretched thin. She kept tugging on Richard's arm, but he was a coiled spring of impotent rage. The true turning point came when Julian led Kate to a quiet alcove where a group of major tech investors were gathered. One of them was a man named Carter Finch, a venture capitalist. Richard had been desperate to court for a new project. Kate had hosted Carter and his wife for dinner twice at her old home, charming them with her knowledge of art and vintage wine, a dinner Richard had later taken full credit for. "Carter, good to see you," Julian said warmly. Carter Finch broke into a broad smile, his eyes lighting up. "Julian, I didn't think you were coming." His smile then extended to Kate. "And Kate, it's wonderful to see you. You look absolutely radiant. Richard didn't mention you were here." The subtle barb was not lost on anyone. "Kate is here as my guest," Julian stated simply. "She's launched her own bespoke jewelry house, Atelier Vance. The talent she used to apply to Richard's social calendar is now being put to much better use." Kate felt a blush of pleasure at the compliment. "It's lovely to see you again, Carter," she said. Carter looked from her to the fuming Richard across the room. He was a shrewd man who understood power dynamics better than anyone. He had seen the drama at the entrance. "Well," he said with a decisive clap of his hands, "Richard's loss is clearly the art world's gain. And yours, Julian." He then turned his full attention to Kate. "My wife's 50th is next month. I've been looking for something truly unique. Perhaps you and I should talk." It was a public shifting of allegiance, a clear and brutal signal. Carter Finch was aligning himself with Julian Devereaux and by extension with Kate. The deal Richard had been chasing was in all likelihood dead. Richard had tried to bar her from the party, but in doing so he had inadvertently cost himself millions and handed her the greatest business opportunity of her life on a silver platter. The sight of Carter Finch pointedly engaging Kate in an animated conversation was the final straw for Richard. His carefully constructed world where he was the sun and everyone else were mere planets orbiting him was collapsing in real time. He couldn't stand it. He excused himself abruptly from his conversation, leaving Tiffany pouting, and strode across the ballroom, his face a mask of controlled fury. He intercepted Kate and Julian as they were moving from Carter Finch's group towards the terrace. "Julian," he said, his voice dangerously low, "a word, if I may." He completely ignored Kate as if she were a piece of furniture. Julian stopped turning to face him. He didn't seem surprised, merely expectant. "Richard?" "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Richard hissed, keeping his voice down but failing to hide the venom in it. "But I think you should be aware of who you're associating with." "I'm perfectly aware," Julian replied, his tone icy calm. "I'm associating with Ms. Vance, a talented designer." Richard scoffed a bitter, ugly sound. "A designer? Please, don't be naive. You know what she is. She was my wife. She didn't have a creative bone in her body until my money was on the line. She's a parasite, Julian, a world-class gold digger. She sees your deep pockets and she's latching on just like she did with me." Every word was a poisoned dart designed to wound Kate, to strip away the confidence she had just begun to wear so comfortably. The old Kate would have shrunk back, stung into silence by the familiar venom of his accusations. But the woman standing in the silver dress with the phoenix around her neck was not the old Kate. Before Julian could even respond, she stepped forward slightly, meeting her ex-husband's furious gaze with a look of glacial calm. "Is that what you tell yourself, Richard?" she asked, her voice clear and steady, drawing the attention of those nearby. "That I was nothing without you, because I remember things differently. I remember the Japanese investors you almost lost because you couldn't be bothered to learn a single thing about their culture. I remember entertaining them, speaking to them about the art of kintsugi and saving your deal. I remember rewriting your speeches so you sounded less like a tyrant and more like a visionary. I remember building the social network that you so arrogantly believe is yours alone." She took another step closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "You say I'm a gold digger, but the truth is you're a hollow man. You surround yourself with beautiful things, art cars women, because you have no beauty inside of you. You didn't discard me, Richard. You lost me. Because you were so terrified that people might realize that your wife, the parasite, was actually the one propping up your fragile ego all along. The color drained from Richard's face. He was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had expected tears, fear, submission. He had not expected a warrior. Julian Devereux, who had remained silent throughout her speech, now delivered the final devastating blow. He looked Richard up and down with an expression of profound disappointment. The true measure of a man sterling is not how he treats his equals, but how he treats those he believes are beneath him. Julian said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a judge's sentence. You've just shown everyone in this room your true measure, and frankly, it's pathetic. With that, Julian placed a gentle hand on the small of Kate's back and guided her away, leaving Richard standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, exposed and utterly defeated. The people who had been covertly watching the exchange now looked away not with pity, but with contempt. The king was not only naked, he was small. Julian guided Kate through a set of French doors and onto a sweeping stone balcony that overlooked the twinkling expanse of Central Park. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and the distant sounds of the city provided a peaceful counterpoint to the buzzing gossip inside. For a few moments they stood in a comfortable silence, gazing out at the familiar skyline that suddenly looked brand new to Kate. "Thank you," she finally said, turning to face him. The moonlight softened the sharp angles of his face, revealing a depth in his gray eyes she hadn't seen before. "For everything. But most of all for letting me fight my own battle back there." "I never doubted for a second that you would win it," he replied. "Some people roar to prove they are lions. Others like you simply are." He gestured towards her necklace. "The Phoenix, you chose its name well." A genuine smile touched her lips. "I feel like I've been living in a cage for 10 years and someone finally left the door open." "You were the one who flew out, Kate," he corrected gently. "All on your own." They spoke for what felt like hours. He asked about her design process, and his questions were insightful, showing a genuine understanding of gemology and metalwork. He wasn't just making polite conversation, he was truly interested. She in turn felt comfortable enough to ask him a question that had been nagging at her. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me tonight? We've never met." Julian leaned against the balustrade, his silhouette dark against the city lights. "That's not entirely true," he said, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. "I feel as though I've known a part of your work for some time." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. He swiped through a few photos before turning the screen towards her. The image displayed was of a pair of cufflinks. They were stunningly unique, crafted from titanium, and inlaid with a mosaic of lapis lazuli designed to look like a star chart of the night sky. Kate gasped. "The celestial cufflinks. That was from my very first collection. I made them right after I left Richard. I put them in a small charity auction for emerging artists to try and get my name out there. They were bought by an anonymous online bidder. I never knew who." Her eyes lifted from the phone screen to his face, the realization dawning on her. "It was you." He nodded. "I collect pieces from promising new artists. When I saw those, I was struck by the vision and the precision. They were bold and yet deeply personal. I looked up the artist Atelier Vance. I read an article about your story. I was impressed. And when my curator friend mentioned he was looking for something fresh for the Jewels of Tomorrow exhibit, your name was the first that came to mind." He paused, his gaze steady and sincere. "I didn't defend you tonight to be a white knight, Kate. I did it because I believe in your talent. Sterling's brutish behavior simply provided the opportunity. I had already planned on introducing myself to you tonight and discussing the Sotheby's placement." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't a random act of kindness. It wasn't a billionaire saving a damsel in distress for his own amusement. It was a calculated professional endorsement from someone who had recognized her worth long before this night. He hadn't rescued her from Richard's world. He had invited her into his, a world where talent, not name or connections, was the ultimate currency. The gratitude she felt was so overwhelming it left her breathless. It wasn't just about the career boost, it was the validation. For years Richard had told her she was nothing, a mere accessory. And here was a man of far greater substance and taste, telling her she was an artist, and he had the receipts literally to prove it. I don't know what to say, she stammered, a single happy tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. Julian reached out, not to wipe the tear away, but to gently tap the fire opal at her throat. "Say you'll accept the spot at Sotheby's," he said softly. "Show them all what a phoenix can do when she's truly free to fly." As the gala began to wind down, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Richard, Sterling, and Tiffany had made a hasty, quiet exit an hour earlier, unable to withstand the cold shoulders and sympathetic glances now directed entirely at Kate. The story of the confrontation at the door, Julian's grand entrance, and Richard's subsequent verbal takedown had spread through the ballroom like wildfire. By the end of the night, Kate Vance wasn't the ex-wife. She was the main character. She had collected a dozen business cards from gallery owners, stylists, and potential clients, including a firm order from Carter Finch that would keep her studio busy for the next 6 months. The future of Atelier Vance, which had seemed so fragile just hours ago, was now blindingly bright. When Julian offered to see her home, she accepted without hesitation. They left the party to a flurry of camera flashes, but this time Kate didn't shrink from them. She smiled a genuine, radiant smile that had nothing to do with the Sterling and everything to do with the Vance. The ride in the Rolls-Royce was quiet and comfortable. The city lights streamed past the window, painting the plush leather interior in strokes of neon and gold. "So," Julian said, breaking the silence as they neared her neighborhood, "Sotheby's will need the piece by the end of the week. Do you have something in mind?" Kate opened her clutch and carefully took out the velvet case. She opened it, revealing the emerald cocktail ring. It was a magnificent square-cut Colombian emerald set in a complex, cage-like platinum setting that was both modern and timeless. Julian took the case, his long fingers surprisingly gentle. He studied the ring under the dim interior light. "The Viridian Cage." He read the small inscription she had etched inside. "Why that name?" "Because for a long time I felt like a beautiful thing trapped in a gilded cage." She answered honestly. "This ring is about acknowledging the cage but focusing on the gem, the part that is strong and valuable and can't be contained forever." He looked from the ring back to her, and in his eyes she saw not pity but profound understanding. "It's a masterpiece, Kate. It will be the star of the auction." When the car pulled up outside her modest but charming brownstone, the chauffeur opened her door, but Kate remained seated for a moment. "Julian," she began, "I know I've said it a dozen times tonight, but I can't thank you." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't thank me. Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never let anyone ever again make you feel like you don't belong in any room you choose to enter. Your talent is your invitation." She met his gaze, and in that moment a connection was forged that was deeper than gratitude or business. It was a bond of mutual respect, a recognition of two minds seeing the world in the same way. "I promise," she said, her voice firm. He smiled a true warm smile that transformed his entire face. "Good. Now my curator will be in touch tomorrow, and perhaps," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "you and I could have dinner next week to celebrate your imminent success. No business, no networking, just dinner." It wasn't a pity date or a power play. It was an invitation from a man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was and who she was becoming. "I would like that very much," she said. As Kate Vance walked up the steps to her own front door, under the watchful, respectful gaze of Julian Devereux, she felt the last remnants of her old life fall away. She had walked to the gala that night, hoping for a small opportunity. She was walking away from it with a future she had previously only dared to dream of. The phoenix hadn't just risen from the ashes. She had taken flight, and the whole world was now her sky. 1 month after the Starlight Gala, the air inside the grand auction room at Sotheby's, New York, was electric. The event was Jewels of Tomorrow, and the room was a sea of discreet wealth collectors, investors, and museum curators who communicated in subtle nods, and the almost imperceptible lift of a numbered paddle. Kate sat in the third row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. To her right was Clara, who squeezed her hand in encouragement. To her left was Julian Devereaux, a picture of calm confidence that served as an anchor for her churning nerves. Her piece, The Viridian Cage, was the final lot of the evening. When its image flashed onto the large screens flanking the auctioneer's podium, a hushed murmur swept through the room. The Vogue feature had been published the week before, a stunning 2-page spread that lauded Kate Vance as a vital new voice in modern jewelry design. The article, coupled with the potent cocktail of gossip from the gala, had created an unprecedented buzz. Lot 24, The Viridian Cage, by Kate Vance. The auctioneer announced, his voice smooth and practiced. A magnificent Colombian emerald in a bespoke platinum setting, a truly singular piece from a designer of immense talent. We shall open the bidding at $100,000. Kate's breath hitched. 100,000 was already more than she had dared to hope for. Instantly, a paddle went up. 100,000, the auctioneer confirmed. 125, another voice called out. 150. The bids climbed rapidly, the numbers echoing in the hushed room. 150 became 200. 200 became 250. Kate felt lightheaded. This was beyond her wildest dreams. Antoine Dubois, the MoMA curator, was in the race, his expression scholarly and intense. A woman in the front row, rumored to be bidding for a Saudi princess, was his main competitor. Then, just as the bidding reached $300,000, a new player entered the game. 350,000. The voice came from the back of the room near the entrance. It was sharp, aggressive, and painfully familiar. Kate's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her heart sinking. There, standing in the shadows, was Richard Sterling. He looked haggard, thinner than a month ago, and a desperate, obsessive glint shone in his eyes. He held paddle number 113. Julian's hand subtly rested on her arm, a silent message of support. "Ignore him," he murmured, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. "This is not about him." But it felt like it was. Richard wasn't just bidding on a ring. He was trying to buy back his narrative. He wanted to own her success, to possess the one thing that had been born from her freedom, and in doing so prove that she was still in some way his property. The Saudi representative bid 375. 400! Richard snapped immediately, his voice ringing with challenge. Antoine Dubois, the curator, adjusted his glasses and gave a calm, decisive nod. 450,000. 500,000? Richard's voice was getting louder now, drawing stares. This was no longer a sophisticated auction. It was a street fight. He was bleeding money, but his pride was hemorrhaging faster. A tense silence fell over the room. The auctioneer looked towards the curator. Dubois gave a small, regretful shake of his head. The museum had a budget. He had reached his limit. A triumphant, ugly smirk began to form on Richard's lips. He was going to win. He was going to take this from her. Going once. The auctioneer began his gaze on Richard. Going twice. $1 million. The voice was not Julian's. It was calm, clear, and came from his phone, which he had just lifted to his ear. Julian listened for a moment and then spoke to the auctioneer. "My apologies for the interruption. I am on the line with a private client of mine in Zurich. His bid is $1 million. The room erupted in gasps. Richard Sterling's face turned ashen. He had thrown $500,000 on the table out of sheer ego, and Julian had just swatted it away like an insect quadrupling the last serious bid without a flicker of emotion. It was the ultimate power play, a demonstration that Richard wasn't even in the same league. He was a man playing checkers at a grandmaster's chess tournament. Humiliated, defeated, and now visibly shaking, Richard threw his paddle onto an empty chair and stormed out of the auction house, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him. $1 million going once, the auctioneer said, his professional poise barely concealing his own shock. Going twice, sold to Mr. Devereaux's client. The room broke into applause. Kate turned to Julian, her eyes wide with a million questions. Who was that? Julian ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. A slow smile spread across his face. "A very dear friend," he said, "the new head of acquisitions for the Devereaux Foundation. We've just started a collection dedicated to modern decorative arts. I thought the Viridian cage would be the perfect piece to inaugurate it." He had not only ensured her ring sold for a life-changing amount, he had acquired it for his own family's prestigious collection, cementing its status as a true work of art. He hadn't rescued her. He had invested in her. Later that week, Kate's studio was a hive of activity. The news of the auction had made her the most sought-after designer in the city. Apprentices now handled the ringing phones and shipments while Kate focused on what she loved creating. She was sketching at her workbench when Julian arrived holding a bottle of champagne. They celebrated amidst the scent of polishing compounds and hot metal her world. As he poured the bubbling liquid, he told her he had heard that Carter Finch had officially pulled his venture capital from Richard's new project, citing a crisis of confidence in the leadership. Yet Tiffany the model had been photographed with a young Italian shipping heir. Richard's empire, both social and financial, was crumbling not from one grand explosion, but from 1,000 small cuts, each one delivered by his own hubris. Kate felt no joy at his downfall, only a quiet sense of justice. Her focus was no longer on him or the past. It was here in her studio, in the weight of a new piece of gold in her hands, in the warm, intelligent eyes of the man standing beside her. "To the inauguration," Julian toasted, clinking his glass against hers. "No," Kate said, smiling. "To building our own cages, and filling them with whatever we choose." He looked at her, his admiration clear. In her he saw not a phoenix who had risen from ashes, but a master architect who was now building a brand new world from the ground up, a world where she was both the creator and the queen. And so Kate's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest betrayals can lead to the most incredible breakthroughs. Her ex-husband tried to lock her out to erase her from the world she helped build, but he only succeeded in pushing her into the spotlight she truly deserved. It's a powerful lesson in karma and self-worth. Never let the opinion of someone who doesn't value you define who you are. The right people, the ones who recognize your true brilliance, will always find a way to open the door for you. Kate's journey from being an overlooked wife to a celebrated artist had just begun, all because one man tried to block her and another saw her worth. Did you enjoy this story of revenge and rebirth? If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next real-life drama. Comment below with what you think Richard's reaction was the next day. We'll see you in the next story.